Hello everyone, and welcome to the 2022 Insights from Women Leaders series. We launched the series in October of 2020 to highlight the journeys and contributions of various women leaders who share their insights on a range of topics impacting their industries, our communities, and their role in shaping the future. Our guests have included leaders from various prestigious and reputable institutions from across the globe. Their backgrounds are diverse, their accomplishments many, and the insights and perspectives they provide are extremely valuable. Now, the goal is to learn from women thought leaders and decision makers to empower current and future leaders, both men and women, to positively impact organizations and communities. Now, diversity of thought, experiences, industries, education, and training is important to us as it highlights the mosaic of perspectives represented in different settings that help drive decision-making and positive change. Now, I will have about a 40-minute conversation with the leader, structured using questions we've traditionally asked our guest leaders. Now, we ask the leaders similar questions throughout the series. This allows you to see the differences in response and lived experiences. After that, I ask questions sent to us from the public prior to the session. Now, I'm going to go ahead and welcome our guest leader today, Dr. Vinika Rao. She is the Executive Director at INSEAD Emerging Markets Institute, Gender Initiative, and Africa Initiative, as well as the Asia Director for the Hoffman Global Institute for Business and Society in Asia. She's also Adjunct Professor at the Singapore Management University. Her research is in gender diversity in leadership, male allyship, and multi-generational influences in the workplace. She is frequently invited to speak on related topics and quoted and published in leading business publications. Dr. Rao started her career with MNC Bank and went on to become managing director of an Asian conglomerate before a serendipitous transition to education. Prior to INSEAD, she was associate professor of strategy at the SP Jain Center of Management in Singapore. She taught MBA, executive MBA at undergrad students and conducted specialized programs for corporate clients. She has an MBA from IIM Bangalore and an award-winning doctorate from the Singapore Management University. She currently sits on the board of a nonprofit organization and a think tank and advises diversity and inclusion initiatives at global organizations. She's particularly passionate about supporting women managers to make fulfilling work-life decisions, aiming to do this through active sponsorship rather than mentorship alone, which is wonderful. I think this is definitely one of our aims here as well. She strives to engage both men and women in the effort to foster gender balance and create equity, diversity, and inclusion in their organizations and communities. Welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you, Rola. It's a real pleasure to be with you. You're doing some really important work. Very happy to contribute.
Wonderful. Thank you. So let's just jump into the questions. We have a lot of questions and I'm eager to hear your perspective on them. Now, we ask all the guest leaders the same first question, and that is, did you expect to be where you are today?
So that's a very interesting question, and the response is a categorical no. Not on the professional front, not on the personal front, and actually not even on the geographical front. Professionally speaking, after completing my MBA many eons ago, it feels like now, I had landed my dream banking job, and I thought I was set to be a career banker. I could almost visualize my retirement gold watch from the bank, when I was going to leave. And even on the personal front, I thought everything was mapped out. I had just gotten married to another banker, and then life happened. In fact, I did a TEDx talk some years back on this about making unexpected career and personal choices under the title of Dare to Dream. And a lot of young people enjoyed it. So I realized that there are some lessons here for people to just listen to. So what actually happened was that my brand new husband went for what was supposed to be a short business trip abroad. And he came back with a job offer that was just too good to turn down. But there was a small catch, which was that it was going to be in a different country in which we had no connections and would probably involve my having to make a change in my job. But we were young, we had no responsibilities, and quite frankly, we were excited by the promised paycheck. And so we promptly packed our bags, and that's how we landed up in Jakarta, Indonesia. What that meant was that suddenly, I had to go from being on a fast-track banking career path to being a trailing spouse. I had to adjust to being the expat wife and also to take up a job in a different industry from what I'd expected to be doing. Along the way, I joined another American multinational, this time in the field of industrial specialty chemicals, of all things, as far removed from banking as could be. But, things worked. I think hard work matters. And I progressed to become their first female, first Asian, and youngest general manager ever. So things were working out. In my last corporate job, I was managing director of a Southeast Asian conglomerate. And again, I was happy, well settled in that role in life. And then serendipity kicked in again and made me move into my second career, this time in the field of higher education. So, like a lot of other professionals, I used to do guest talks at business schools, just sharing practitioner advice. And I happened to meet a visionary academic who suggested I teach one full course as a visiting faculty for an MBA program. I was very nervous. I know how we used to teach our own professors when I was doing my MBA, but I took it on as a challenge. And Rola, fortunately, it worked out really well. And that was how I stepped into the world of higher education 15 years back. And I've never looked back. And I think the important thing is, I really believe in the saying that the road to success is always under construction. And so it's important to feel free to experiment, to try out new things, and to dare to dream. And I think hopefully that's what I've done.
That's so wonderful. Yeah, I always love to hear about different people's experiences, how it puts them in different positions. And I love how you refer to it as serendipitous, right? And I think it just adds that kind of hopeful touch to it. But now thinking about your future, obviously with serendipitous, you not necessarily know what might come up, but what do you think is in your future? What do you want your legacy to be?
Well, I think the main thing is I hope I'll continue to enjoy doing what I do. At this stage in my career, I feel grateful for being free of the burden to have to prove anything to myself or to anyone else, or also to do anything for purely financial reasons, which is a big plus, of course. So I'd like to keep exploring new professional adventures in line with another one of my favorite quotes, which is that if you're willing to fail interestingly, then you're also likely to succeed interestingly. You asked about legacy. That's a big word. I'm not sure I'll do anything to deserve it. But what I would like to continue to focus on is to support women managers to make fulfilling work-life decisions. While I don't think anyone of any gender can have it all, I do think that we can manage with some careful planning and the right attitude to make life very satisfying on both the professional and personal fronts. So I hope to provide this support to female professionals through active sponsorship, as you mentioned earlier, given that I do believe that women can be over-mentored and under-sponsored in some corporate situations. And I would also very much like to engage the men in this effort to foster gender balance in their organizations and communities, because I'm sure we all agree that gender imbalance is not a problem that impacts any one gender, it impacts us all.
Yeah. For sure. And I think it's interesting with the word legacy, like you mentioned. For a lot of guest leaders, it's a very big word. For some of us, we tend to try to simplify it, or it becomes kind of our life's work, which I think this is a great reflection of what you're talking about in terms now it's become your life's work. But how do you believe that your past and present experiences have really shaped this outlook for you? Why is it brought to light and made this such an important part of your life's work?
Thank you. That is always an important question. I think we do need to look back at our experiences and how they've shaped us. I think as a woman of color, I've had many very positive and a few negative experiences that have made me aware and sensitive to challenges that professional women face. At the same time, I've had some very supportive male bosses and a wonderfully encouraging husband who've sensitized me to the impact that a strong ally can have, both at work and at home. And in fact, this was the motivation for my doctorate thesis some years back on the mechanism by which male allyship can work to positively impact female followers' careers. Especially now, given the ramifications of the COVID pandemic continuing to manifest across the globe, and the boundaries between work and home getting more and more blurred, as frequently we're forced to return to working from home for a majority of the workforce. I'm excited to explore how having strong sort of gender balancing foundations at home through this kind of supportive family and social network can positively impact the future of work for women managers.
Yeah, I love, and I noticed this something about you and your experiences, and the way you've approached this very much has centered around empowering women, but also that whole idea of when we all win, like when both of us win, we all win, right? And so it's just in the sense of like encouraging or kind of empowering and understanding that I think like many of us, especially depending on the fields that we're in, we're mentored by great men, leaders as well, and to recognize how that also plays such an instrumental role in women empowerment and women growth as leaders as well, and to have that. And so I think that's really great. And I think us supporting one another, and being kind of, well, focusing not just on us, but kind of how the whole dynamic works, I think is really powerful. Because like you mentioned, a lot of our experiences, and I think I'm similar in the way that in my field, I was mentored by men leaders. There was wonderful female leaders, but in reality, we have to kind of think about how do we grow all together to ensure that we all win. So that is so great. Can you share some failures or challenges that you experienced that have shaped your outlook or made you do things differently? And maybe anything that you wished you would have maybe done differently or made a cautious effort to change in the future?
Yeah, if I may, I think I'll take a sort of professional look at this one. So one of the continuing disappointments that we face here in Asia is the still low number of women on corporate boards. And of course, this is true elsewhere in the world too, but my focus is in this region. Now, this despite all the efforts that various organizations and governments have been taking in recent years. Because of my work and my own sort of interest, I often hear from senior management and HR professionals that they're actively looking for women candidates to sort of build the board pipeline, but they just have not been able to find anyone with the right experience or work background. And what I point out to them is that if they will keep on looking for women who've had what they consider relevant experience, meaning, as C-suite executives or in other board positions in the same industry, well, then they're just going to keep on facing the same shortage. Because after all, it is precisely this paucity of senior women that we're seeking to correct. So what I tell them is that they need to look for women who have the right skills and attitude and de-emphasize the need for relevant so-called industry experience, because that's what's going to bring true diversity to their boards. And so, that's one thing that I hope to do more of going forward, is to spread this message more strongly to everyone who's willing to listen to me.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful too. And I think I've often heard that too, especially even within our conversations here in terms of, or other people or other leaders saying, well, we're not getting enough candidates for that. And I think that's where, and you mentioned this as such an instrumental role about sponsorship versus mentorship. So if you're focused so much on being a good sponsor, you're also more likely to, bring up and, talk about other female leaders or other individuals that could be great leaders or great individuals for this position, your female colleagues. And that's where sponsorship comes in, right? That's going beyond that mentorship type of thing and being part of that. So they might not apply, but mentioning their name and having ability of people seeking out those individuals is very, I think, important. And just for some of our listeners that might not know the difference between sponsorship and mentorship, how do you see the differences there?
Yeah, I think mentorship is something everyone understands, but perhaps sponsorship is, is a step forward. It's a step beyond that. It's in terms of making those active introductions that you spoke about, Rola, putting yourself in a position where you're actually recommending someone strongly for a job, for instance, and saying that you're completely you believe strongly that this person is absolutely the best person for that role. So putting that mentorship one step further and sort of actively making not just an introduction, but a very strong recommendation for someone would be one of the ways that I consider relevant. The other thing is to share actively of your network when appropriate, which also goes a long way. Exactly as you mentioned, Rola, it's at the right time to have the right connection can go a long way.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so now what excites you about the future? What do you look forward to?
So, one thing that I've done recently, which is different from what I've been doing the last few years, is that besides my day job, I've also resumed teaching younger students, undergraduates, after many years, because most of my work in the last few years has been with, business school students, MBA, executive MBA, and senior executives. And I'm actually really enjoying this experience because I'm looking now at the workplace through the eyes of 20-somethings, including my own daughter. And these are kids who perhaps never experienced a pre-COVID workplace. And that brings fresh lessons every day. Lessons on how quickly things can change. And so how agile and adaptable we all need to be under what I call these essentially VUCA conditions that we're living through right now. You asked me about what excites me about the future. So I think I feel excited about the future when I talk to these young people and I witness the steps that generations Y and Z are taking to counter the human-created ravages to our planet. I feel excited about the future when I see businesses going beyond what might be, legally required to truly emerge as forces for good, positively impacting their community and building sustainability into every aspect of their value chains. And I think especially optimistic about the future when I see that the diversity, equity, and inclusion measures that we've been talking about, and which are now being introduced more and more by organizations and governments, when I see that these are accepted with respect and a sense of deep responsibility by the communities that they seek to benefit, because that's when they really will have impact.
Yeah, well, that's great. I think that's definitely something I love about academia as well, is that the energy that you get from the students, their excitement about the future, the hopefulness, but also their, because they've been exposed to so much information and all of these important topics, right? It's really brought to light. And then I think that makes us more hopeful because people have to be a lot more intentional about these types of topics as well. So we talk a lot about tools and skills that we need in this series. And so thinking through all of these challenges and kind of your life's work, and I think what is important to you, and really I think what's important to us as a society, what do you think we need to consider moving forward in terms of skills that we need to build or tools that we should kind of think about?
Yeah, I think, I'm looking at this in the context of preparing for a post-COVID or a COVID normal workplace. And the agility and adaptability that I mentioned earlier will continue to be key. Also, as always, an inquiring mind to foster innovation, and very importantly, a readiness to continuously upgrade our skills in order to stay relevant. I think perhaps I would also add humility, the humility to accept that even if one is the CEO of an organization, for instance, there are many things that the junior most intern in the firm can teach us that we know very little about. For instance, I love the reverse mentoring and initiatives that some companies are adopting now with true commitment. And I think that's a great sign of how you can sort of continuously learn and keep an open mind to where that learning can come from.
Yeah, definitely. Those are great. Now let's talk a little bit more about what you're currently working on, kind of the present moment, come back to where we are now. Can you share some current initiatives that you're working on that you're really excited about?
Thank you. I appreciate the chance to talk about that. So I do wear multiple hats at INSEAD, so various interesting initiatives that I can share. At the INSEAD Gender Initiative, we're engaged in research and the development of pedagogical tools that support businesses and individuals seeking to increase gender balance. We've just launched a new free newsletter. So if anyone is keen to understand what we're up to, then that's a great place to subscribe to that website, to that newsletter through our website. INSEAD is also now the partner for the UN He for She campaign. And we're highlighting our commitment to building allies and to creating gender balance, both inside our own business school and in the communities that we influence. Likewise, for the Hoffman Global Institute for Business and Society, for which I'm the Asia Director, we have an active page on LinkedIn, which is a great way to know about our work, as well as through subscribing to our newsletter there. We have several interesting collaborations that are happening, which I can keep talking about for a long time, but I think that will take too long. I might quickly mention that we're the knowledge partner for Change Now in Europe, a very interesting conference coming up soon, and the Stewardship Leader Awards in Asia. For our newly launched INSEAD Africa initiative and the well-established Emerging Markets Institute, we continue to work in a collaborative way to foster the highest standards of business education, as well as social and economic development in these regions. So if any of your listeners want to know more about these initiatives, do please reach out. I'll be very happy to tell you more.
Yeah, that's so great. And I think what you're currently working on and kind of your background speaks to the need for us to also think of ourselves, beyond just our communities, but globally, right? The pandemic is the prime example of we're all dependent on each other, and the ability of information or a pandemic to cross borders is very easy. And so now kind of understanding that learning from different areas, countries, businesses, how we grow is so important. So I love hearing about your because it's just so diverse. We go from one geography to another in terms of that, but with all, I think, topics and areas that are of interest to everybody. And when we build up communities in what seems to be very different countries, we all benefit as well. So, which is so great. Now, we do believe in sleep here, but this question is more about what obstacles or challenges really keep you up at night or that you're really thinking about.
Yeah, perhaps I wouldn't say they were obstacles that keep me awake at night. I think it's more about thinking through the various opportunities that keep coming up in our very dynamic sort of environment, and in making sure that we don't lose out on those opportunities. So making sure that I'm exploring ways to leverage them, especially in our work on building responsible business leaders for the future, which is something that we take very seriously at INSEAD. And so that's something that I think is constantly keeping me on my toes anyway.
Yeah, no, that's great. There's a audience question about that. Remind me about when you have so many opportunities, but we'll ask that towards the end, choosing between everything. But what new initiatives would you say have emerged as a result of the pandemic? Obviously, what you've been building is something that you've been building over several years, but what has kind of emerged because of the pandemic?
There are two things that I can think about in that respect. First, there's been a lot of interest in the future of work post-pandemic, how it has changed the way we look at the workplace. One of the things that comes up is the ideas around how multiple generations will work together in the workplace of the future. We had a white paper that we developed at the Emerging Markets Institute a few years back that highlighted how, for the first time in human history, we have so many generations working together. Because on the one hand, older workers are living longer and healthier and retiring later. And on the other hand, younger workers are joining on a flexible basis, even as they study sometimes, through gig work, etc. And so the implications of this, given that different generations can have very different expectations and attitude towards the workplace of the future. So this has both challenges and opportunities. And so especially when, as I mentioned earlier, there are younger workers who've never worked in a pre-pandemic world. So now when we start preparing for a situation where we're asking people to come back into physical offices, there will be issues around that. So that's certainly one area that I think is interesting that the pandemic has thrown up. The other interesting aspect that has come up is due to the changes brought about by the normalization of teleworking. The pandemic, because it's forced so many of us into working from home, working flexibly, it's changed the mental models around who needs flexibility more. It used to be the assumption was it's always the women who need it, but it's meant now that working parents, for instance, both fathers and mothers, have been able to participate more actively in childcare. It has also removed some of the hidden penalties associated with taking advantage of any existing work from home or flexible work possibilities. However, I should mention that on the negative side, we do have evidence now that the pandemic has disproportionately impacted women. You've read about this and heard about this. Many women have lost their jobs or have taken a step back in their careers, voluntarily too in some cases, in order to manage the challenging domestic situations that have been created as a result of the pandemic. For instance, when children have to stay home from school because it's not safe for them to go in physically, well then this exacerbates the dreaded second shift of work for women who now have to not only manage their own careers and their own work teams virtually, but also have to manage their families in person at home. Just to try and close this particular question on a positive note, I think one good aspect that has come out of this pandemic is the amount of data that is being collected. Hopefully, we'll have many more learnings from this data, which will be useful in similar crisis situations in the future. Unfortunately, I'm sure there will be more. And so, hopefully we will have some concrete learnings from this one.
Very nice. So the next question pertains to more the topic of success. And when we talk about success, we like to first define it. So how would you define success?
I think to keep it really short, I would define success as simply being able to work at something one enjoys, so it just doesn't feel like work.
Very nice. I read something today, and it was talking about the difference between success sometimes and fulfillment. And sometimes when leaders are very metric driven, they tend to consider success also reaching goals, right? Like, so it's like a success if you reach it, versus if you tie success and fulfillment then becomes of, did you enjoy what you're doing? Do you find passionate? Do you find impact in it? And so merging those two, I think I've found throughout the leaders too, is the ones that are much more kind of goal centric. They've kind of defined it with their goals to say that, yes, I've accomplished it. And it's kind of like a check mark, versus those that have integrated success with fulfillment tend to answer it like you had mentioned. So I've noticed that as well. So how, we know that there's kind of the individual success for us when we look at success as individuals, but then also to be successful, and however you define it, there also needs to be kind of this environment. And we talk a lot about your environment and how that influences your success. So how do you create your own environment for success?
I think a very important part of that environment for success is to, create this atmosphere of constant upskilling, keeping an open mind, just so that, sort of being very open to new experiences, and surrounding myself with people that I can learn from, irrespective of their age. Lots of wisdom comes from the young, as I'm constantly learning at work every day. And I think one very important part of my environment for success is a tool that is unfortunately going out of fashion now: books. Reading.
Like the actual books that are
well, they can be physical books, or they can be books that you read on Kindle, or whichever other way. But the thing is about constantly finding new books to read. They could be work related, but I read everything. My family jokes about how I will read literally everything, including cereal boxes, etc. But the thing is, it just sort of keeps you very relevant. It keeps you well informed, and honestly, in my case, they're the best friends one can have, and they keep you happy.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. I think it was something too that I've been listening to recently, how this generation kind of is reading less books, and how that's actually a detriment to not only our attention, but just like you had mentioned, you learn so much regardless of what you're reading, whatever genre. So okay, so as leaders, we know that we can't do everything ourselves, but asking for help or support is difficult for some. I feel like I notice that a lot with my female colleagues as well. And everyone's needs really differ. So how does support look like for you, and how have you prioritized these conversations throughout your own career and maybe with your teams as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's a powerful lesson to learn as early as possible, because as you say, it's true that people have very different needs and different ways of seeking support, or even accepting it when it is offered. I can't say that I've actively prioritized, network building or support creating conversations for myself throughout my career. I'm a little thick-skinned and terribly scared to impose. And so that did keep me reticent about seeking support early in my career. And as you said, that's something you've seen with your own colleagues too. But one lesson that I have learned over the years, which I would like to share with your listeners, is that most people are actually very willing to help when asked, provided you ask after having done your background research, and it has to obviously be a clear and reasonable request, not a general, non-specific request of the sort that, you look up their website and you'll find it anyway, because no busy person has the time to answer those. But as long as it's a carefully framed, well thought out question, or, request for even very specific help, I think you would be surprised by how much more willing people are to sort of support than we would imagine. And as we've said, in the past too, for me, valuable support personally has always come through active sponsorship rather than mentorship alone, which is what reinforces my desire to continue to offer that.
Yeah, I think it's great how you also mentioned in terms of recognizing that sometimes when we ask, and being but very deliberate and intentional and understanding and respecting the other person's time and whom we ask, because I think we often get nervous to ask and then we under prepare, right? And so when you're prepared in terms of what is your ask and being very intentional, I think it becomes easier to ask. And I think the beautiful side of that, like you'd mentioned, is there are actually a lot of great people that are willing to have that and kind of be supportive. And I think it also kind of ties a lot with the environment for success. We often talk about when people feel supported, when they feel like they can ask, they kind of create that better environment. So now let's talk about more leadership and mentorship and sponsorship especially. But we ask all of our guest leaders a quote unquote simple question. I always joke about that because I give them like only 1 or 2 sentences to be able to respond to this. But we do ask, how do you describe a leader? Now you responded with the following: And a quintessential VUCA, or which I believe, right, stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, conditions created by COVID-19, leaders need to go beyond creating and communicating an effective vision for their organizations. They need to work alongside their teams with empathy, flexibility, and determination to ensure survival through the crisis and preparedness for the post-COVID world. Can you elaborate on this and what's really shaped your outlook for this definition?
Yeah. Thank you, Rola. And yes, and VUCA, the volatility,
VUCA, yeah.
You got that right. Yes, absolutely. It was a term coined by the military, but it's so applicable for everything that's happening in our environment right now, right?
Yeah.
So, I think the pandemic has taught us a very important lesson in the importance of empathy for leaders. And that's what my quote was about. As the boundaries between work and home have blurred with people teleworking, as we discussed earlier, leaders have perforce become much more aware of the home situations of their team members in ways that they never needed to be earlier. We're all, for instance, more aware of which of our team members has a dedicated workroom at home, and so they don't get disturbed, while who has to share the dining table with their kids when they're working. We've all had team meetings where some team members had to excuse themselves from a meeting to respond to an urgent summons from their kids or their elderly parents, perhaps, that they have to care for now under the situations imposed by the pandemic, or even from pets. Right. And others have had it easier. So this has had an impact on leaders because they've started to become aware of these subtle nuances in people's houses and people's domestic situations. I remember I was invited to write an article for a business magazine some months back about this. And so I'd reached out to some CEOs to describe, what are their experiences in this context. And they spoke about how they've developed more sensitivity to the home situation of their employees and how this has made them realize what they often forgot earlier, which, as one of them described it, is that work is just one part of my team members' lives. And, so that need for understanding and having a little bit more empathy becomes very important. And hence my emphasis in that quote that you read out on the need for leaders today to work alongside their teams with empathy and flexibility as we get through the pandemic.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I've never been, quote unquote, inside of more people's homes than I would have ever, thought possible. And I think it does naturally give people a tendency to kind of relax. There's a different feeling when you're kind of in someone's home in terms of your own, the way you speak to them, the way it's just, you sense something different regardless of the conditions you're around. And then you begin to notice, right, these different elements of the beyond work, right, that everyone kind of goes through. And I think that's something that we all tended to notice, but leaders go beyond that, right? Like, what does that ultimately mean then for work? And I think when you're talking about flexibility and determination to really design a better space, to not just recognize that, but design a better space for them. Do you believe that throughout your experiences, and you've been in different industries and how that's taken, do you believe leadership in general is different across sectors, or is it very similar, or what has been your experience with that?
Yeah, I think many aspects of leadership are actually similar across industry sectors. But I do want to mention, I think there's a very special responsibility now on the leaders in the healthcare sector under the circumstances created by the pandemic, as you mentioned. It's a responsibility that requires them to look beyond their own organizations, to look into the community that now they have a much more direct, immediate, and significant impact on. And I'm going to leave it at that and just say that it creates its own set of challenges that we have to hope that these leaders, who've had this huge sort of extra responsibility thrust upon them, will be able to live up to.
Yeah, no, that's a great point too, because I think now more than ever, they've had to kind of step up and work across industries and kind of have difficult conversations and be able to articulate information that normally would have stayed in the healthcare bubble, right? Or the public health bubble. And I think that's made it harder, right? We've had to kind of step up, and leaders have had to kind of approach the way that they communicate. Maybe their leadership in terms of communication has definitely changed for that. And so kind of learning across sectors, they've had to do a lot of learning across sectors, I feel, for what that looks like in different areas, to be able to like articulate and have a good conversation with leaders from different sectors. Now, leadership in general, throughout my career and even throughout my education, we've talked about leadership in different ways, learned about what is a good leader versus bad leader. And in terms of, even as women leaders, we're often told, not to be like to show as much emotion or to do those types of things. So I think we've heard a lot about what constitutes maybe a good leader, but what do you think we're getting wrong about leadership from all this different messaging that you're hearing and you're just like, no, this is not right. So
yeah, to my mind, I think it's the notion that leaders have all the answers. That's where the mistake is. You know, if it were ever true, which I doubt it ever was, it's definitely not true now with technology and digital innovation, which just makes all our knowledge obsolete just when we've started to feel comfortable with it. You know, just when you think you've understood something, technology just kicks in and everything changes all over again. So, which is why I think one more quality that I would emphasize most for leaders, again, and I'm going to say this one more time, is that quality of humility. You know, because what humility does is it allows us as leaders to learn without embarrassment and to ask questions without loss of face. Because, you know, you can then accept that you don't have to have all the answers yourself as long as you can build teams that do.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. That's so great. Yeah, I think it's so powerful because you'll end up realizing that the good leaders aren't, like you had mentioned, exactly. They don't have all the answers, but they know how to figure it out. They know how to build the teams around them to figure it out, which is so great. Now, what are some leadership lessons and advice that you can provide to our current and future leaders, both men and women? And I know this is very important to you as well, at different stages of their career.
Yeah, I mean, you know, exactly what I've said about leaders in general. I think develop the qualities of empathy, humility, and lifelong learning. And as you emphasized too, Rola, you know, don't expect to have all the answers, but build teams around you and, you know, sort of create this environment of success around you, which allows you to at least have easy access to those answers through your team.
Yeah, that's so great. So what we're going to do, we'll do this last question and then we're going to ask some of the questions that we got ahead of time. Now, the last question is also very similar across the board, but we like to take this opportunity to support one another and actually recognize the positive influence we have on one another. Can you name a woman or two? Traditionally, I've found that the guest leaders want to name two, who's inspired you and why did you choose this person?
Okay, well, thank you. And I will then take that possibility and, you know, mention two women. Actually,
get the free card. Get the
Absolutely. Yes. And yes, so I have been inspired by two women then that I want to mention. And these are two mothers, actually, my own and my husband, so my mother-in-law. You know, they were both very highly educated for their generation. They were lifelong learners who constantly upskilled themselves, despite having no material need to do so and not necessarily having the peer network sort of, you know, forcing it to happen. I think they inspired me through the grace and the courage with which they faced some of the very personal sort of challenging issues that came up in their lives and still managed to make their homes warm, welcoming, and safe places for their spouses and children to blossom. Because I do think that, you know, and having learned this from personal experience, parenting is one of the most challenging roles that any of us is asked to fulfill. It's one of those roles for which you don't get trained, you don't need any qualifications, and I wish you could have had them because it makes such a difference. But getting that parenting role right, while also staying true to yourself as a woman and ensuring your own personal development is a great leadership challenge, which I really think that both these women handled inspiringly well.
Yeah, that's amazing. So we're going to go now to some of the audience questions. Okay, so one that came in, I think you can definitely speak to. So there seems to be a trend with some of the questions that we did get, many of them pertaining to kind of having difficult conversations, whether it be, I'm assuming this is a female writing this question about having difficult conversations maybe with men at work, or maybe have others included having difficult conversations with those that don't necessarily agree with you on a topic. How do you approach those types of difficult conversations? How do they vary for you? And kind of what's some general advice you can give our audience?
I think one thing that's always worked for me and which I would sort of suggest we all do is to sort of approach such conversations with a sense of respect, you know, because that goes a long way. I mean, I think if you sort of start those conversations with self-respect, so respect yourself, but also respect for the person that you're speaking to, often that can just help with a difficult conversation. And, you know, depending upon what the specific conversation is about, again, being very well prepared, I think that's something that goes a long way in terms of just, you know, increasing our own sort of confidence in what we're going ahead to say. And then being true to yourself. This comes up a lot, especially in conversations with women. I mean, I always talk about the fact that you don't have to become like men to be successful at all. Let's just focus on our own qualities that we have, and often that women might have some that are much better at. And I don't want to generalize. It's not necessarily something that changes with the gender. It's just something that is individual specific. So let's focus on our strengths without feeling the need to modify ourselves in any way to be more successful in conversations or negotiations, for instance.
Yeah, that's great. You did mention this in terms of kind of the challenge or things that you think about a lot in terms of the different opportunities or the different initiatives that you're working on. So one question is, how do you prioritize and know what to work on now or next?
That's a big challenge for me too.
Do you have a thought process? Do you have like criteria by which you go? I mean, I think this is something a lot of ambitious people struggle with, and a lot of people with a lot of different interests have. So how have you approached it, especially as someone with a lot of curiosity and different interests in different industries?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it is a challenge. And this is, what I was talking about earlier when you asked about what keeps you awake. Sometimes this is what keeps me awake in terms of there's so many exciting things that you want to do and how do you prioritize. But I do find that, having that difficult conversation with yourself, making that list of, sort of having a careful plan around what you want to do. And then it just helps. I'm one of those people who needs to sort of get everything organized very well. And so I need to put it all into its boxes. What's each going to take, and, what are sort of the advantages of doing some things, what are the pros and cons of each in terms of the timing involved, and then organizing myself accordingly. Just that helps me. In terms of choosing between the various things that need to be done, of course, it's very much a case of your own personal priorities, but also, of course, the impact it's going to have. And sometimes it can also be a case of, low-hanging fruit and sort of get that done quickly, and then so that you are able to focus on some of the more important things. But yeah, I think making lists and careful plans is one of those old-fashioned habits that still work for me.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is definitely probably an opportunity for you to leverage yourself, or anybody as well, to be a good sponsor, in the sense if there's a lot of these exciting initiatives that you have to have done your careful assessment individually, just absolutely don't have the time for, right? And you find that I think a lot of the people that I've spoken to too, they end up saying, well, I cannot put this on my plate. But actually, when they end up leveraging that whole sponsorship mentality, do recommend somebody that could be interested or have that. And I think those kind of build on each other. And then that way you don't feel like you've completely lost because someone has gained in terms of that opportunity as well. But the other question I think it pertains very similar in terms of your time management and being able to juggle so many different types of positions, beyond the good planning and delegation. Do you have any specific recommendations about that with people that kind of juggle multiple hats?
I think, it comes back to two things. One is in terms of what you enjoy doing, and the other one is what you're good at doing, and sort of trying to find this sweet spot between those two, so that's when, at least for me personally, I find that I can define the ones that, fall between the sort of overlapping Venn diagram of these two aspects. Those are the ones that I normally pick to then work on. Just to be able to make sure that I can see the impact for myself personally as an individual, and then in terms of the impact that I can have on the people that I influence. That conversation just takes place in my mind and falls in place once I've looked through these two aspects.
Yeah, that's great. So we have another question about, this person's like, can you provide some advice to a person changing industries or leaving a current position and really worried kind of about the professional community, or, if they're changing something to something completely different, what advice you would provide to them?
Yeah, I mean, and this I can speak to from a personal experience, having, as we were talking earlier, moved industries and moved geographies and functions even. I think there are two things that's important. One is about, again, that learning hat that you're constantly wearing. And the second one is about creating coalitions of support. So the learning aspect we've spoken about. So I'll focus on the other one, which is in terms of, within your own sort of organization and within the larger industry that you're a part of. It's very important to create these formal and informal networks, which can be extremely supportive and very, very useful. especially when you're making a change in your career. And that can even come through, as we discussed earlier, so actively reaching out to people who you think will be able to help you in terms of just making those career decisions. I've had it happen to me where, some people, in my case, it tends to always somehow be women, maybe because they've read about my interest in sort of sponsoring women's careers. But basically, a lot of times people will reach out about some specific career experiences I've had or some specific industry, and then they ask questions about that. And as I said, as long as the request is well thought out and well researched, as you emphasize yourself, Rola, it becomes easy for the person you reach out to be able to offer very specific advice. And again, you can actually ask them for something very specific in terms of how they can help. And so that sort of building that coalition of support for yourself through your own networking can also be very useful when you consider a change in the industry. Of course, I'm assuming that, the learning and all of the technical qualifying, etc., for that is a given that you have to do anyway. But this is about, more, how best to sort of succeed once you've made that transition. And even in terms of helping you to make that decision, it's useful to talk to people in that industry. And again, people are normally quite helpful. Here in Singapore, for instance, I'm saying here in Singapore, though I'm currently sitting in New York, but we have a number of professional associations that are also very useful, very helpful for conversations like that.
Yeah, no, that's really great. There's another question about, what do you consider your greatest accomplishment?
I hope my greatest accomplishment is yet to come. If I had to pick one, I would definitely say, being a mother, having a daughter that I'm proud of, who makes me happy every day, and who's, just about, she's still studying, but she has some very clear ideas now about the career that she wants to build for herself. And I hope that we've helped in some small measure to make her feel confident that she can reach out and do anything that she wants to.
That's wonderful. There's another question. I think we've already talked about the importance of creating a good team to your environment for success, all the way to even, building upon your own skill sets and working towards your projects. But what advice would you provide for the best way to determine if someone is a good team player?
So, I actually have taught something about being a good team player quite recently. So I have that slide right in front of my mind, but I'm going to try not to talk through that one. Your listeners are very, obviously more experienced than that audience that I was talking to. But I think in terms of being a good team player is almost like, how would you choose someone that you'd like to be friends with? What are some of the qualities that we look for in people like that? One of the things that I've realized after so many years of working is, some of the most successful managers that I know are not necessarily the most qualified. They're not necessarily the ones who were perhaps we considered the brightest or the intellectually smartest. Often they were just the people that everyone else got along with, that, people felt comfortable around. That's not to mean that they were not smart. Of course they were. But along with that, they were exactly what, the term team player should be about. They were open-minded. They were willing to listen to other people's opinions. They were willing to share credit where it was due, and basically to come together in such a way that the cohesion of the group becomes more than just the sum of individuals, where we sort of contribute not just to our own development, but also to the achievement of the objectives of the team itself and of everyone else in the group. So I would think of it along the lines of, what you look for in a good friend is something that I think will be helpful in this context.
Very nice. Now, this question, I think, pertains a lot to some of the topics that we actually talked about in terms of globalization and the fact that we're engaging with different professionals across different countries and geographies. What have you found when you engage with professionals from across geographies? Also, what advice, kind of to build on that, and what advice would you provide professionals as they engage with diverse professionals?
Yeah, in my career, I've been to some countries where I've had to learn some very, very basic lessons. For instance, I remember in one, actually the first time I went to Indonesia, one of the things I remember was, when you walk in and you're even served water to drink, for instance, it's polite to wait till you're sort of asked to drink, which I had no clue of. And, the first thing I did when I entered a meeting and, we've been going from one place to the other is like offered a glass, a glass of water was put in front of me. And the first thing I do is glug it down before I start speaking. And it took me time to realize that that wasn't really polite. And I should have waited till, the person I was meeting said, please sort of have a drink of water. So it can be something as basic as that. But I thought it was very important. And so what I've learned to do is to do my research now before I get into situations like this. It's small and nobody's going to be particularly upset with you if you don't follow these cultural nuances. But if you do, I find it goes a long way. It shows respect. It shows that you have, you care enough about the people you're going to meet to have done that little bit of thinking in terms of what is the appropriate way to behave in certain situations. And I think that's something that's very important. Now, all of us these days, are working across boundaries. And depending on how the pandemic goes, we might be doing a lot of work that is going to happen from rooms like you and I are talking right now. But I think in the virtual context, it becomes even more important to value some of these cultural sensitivities. And what that requires is that little bit of extra research, being prepared for those conversations, so you understand what might be helpful and what could detract from what the message that you're trying to pass across.
Yeah. This is very nice because I've found that through our conversation, you're very much of a planner and you like to be very intentional, but also there's that hopeful, that serendipity that you're very open to having. And I think that links with that whole flexibility and empathy side but the determined side is very much, and I think like we see that in different leaders, right? They're very intentional, and that research before, like you mentioned, research before speaking to an individual or your team's research before you speak, across the globe, I think is very important because people often forget how that can really change the dynamic of conversations within that. But I kind of noticed that, and I've absolutely loved that because it's a very organized approach, but at the same time, because we often assume if you're very organized, you're not as flexible, because you just tend to be very structured. So this is really great. But this is really wonderful. We're almost about at time, but I would like to now, bring it back to you. Is there anything that you want to add or advice that you want to provide to our audience before we close out?
I think I'll just pick on what you said last, Rola, in terms of, yes, of course, I do believe in being organized and being prepared, but completely 100% agree that, serendipity, luck even plays a huge part in a lot of things that we do. And so, having that sense of flexibility, to me, actually, having done some preparation in advance actually enhances my willingness and my ability to be flexible, because then, some things just happen and you go with the flow, and that's very important. So just, I would close on the note of, let's stay positive. This too shall pass in terms of the pandemic. And as long as we're sort of constantly willing to be open-minded and learn from every new lesson that life is throwing our way, there is light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you so much for having me, Rola. It's been such fun to talk to you.
No, this has been absolutely wonderful. And I know the audience is going to love it as well, because there's so many key takeaways from this. So thank you so much. And then to everybody listening, we are going to have many more leaders this year. So stay tuned for the other ones as well, which will all also be available. And you're welcome to submit questions ahead of time to those leaders as well on our website. So thank you all for listening. And thank you so much again.
Thank you to your listeners for some wonderful questions. It really made me think. Bye now.